Hi, Eliza.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
Very well, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. I gather you're pressed for time. You got about half an hour max or something?
That's correct, yes.
Well, then we should cut to the chase. You're Eliza Griswold, and I'm Bob Wright, and we're lucky to have you because you're going to go to Nigeria before long, and judging by a New Republic piece you wrote recently, you've been to Somalia not so long ago.
That's right.
And you do this. You go to these places, many of them war-torn areas, as a freelance writer. I know, you do these pieces. You're also working on a book. I have a question that is actually, I think, sexist, just in the sense that I would probably not think to ask it if you were a man.
Sure.
Do you know what the question is? Can you guess?
Yeah, I can guess it, yeah, and I think I can probably guess my answer too, but why don't you share?
Go ahead, guess.
How is it as a woman in these places?
Actually, I was gonna. It was even more sexist. No, it was more sexist than that. Come on, give me some credit.
What do you wear?
No, it wasn't.
What are you wearing?
That bad. It wasn't that bad. It was, why do you go to these war-torn areas? A question I might be less inclined to. Why don't you stay at home and polish your fingernails or something?
Right. Well, I mean, because it's my job. That would be one answer, right?
Yeah, but you gave it to yourself, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a job you chose.
Yeah, initially I really started. I started as a freelance reporter right before September 11th, and then so that was 2000. And then when everybody, after September 11th, everybody and their mother needed a stringer, and so basically.
For the non-journalists out there, we should say that a stringer is like a part-time correspondent. Doesn't work for the newspaper, but gets paid by the piece usually.
Works harder and gets paid less.
Works harder, does better work, and gets less glory.
Exactly. So from the beginning, I was in, as so many people were, but I was in New York on September 11th, and then 2 weeks later I was in Pakistan. So things sort of went from there naturally.
And, okay, now to the slightly less sexist question. What is it like for a woman? I would think let's take a recent posting in Somalia where there are a lot of, at least some quite fundamentalist Muslims. In fact, they had been running the place not so long ago. I would think there are some, can be some benefits as well as some downsides to being a woman.
To be honest with you, I find it much easier. I think it is easier to be a woman at this time and to be doing this kind of reporting within the Muslim world and outside of it. Because what you have, you have the few extra seconds, which are usually the most dangerous if someone were to stop you and look in a car and then, oh, look, that's a woman. Nobody really wants to be stuck kidnapping a woman as easily because it's a pain to keep one. And in addition to that, you just do get a bit of a distance and respect. Now, when it comes to sort of high-level interviews, you're really getting that interview based on who you're writing for anyway. So if you're writing for The Atlantic or The New Republic, they're really thinking about that name rather than whether you're a woman or not. So I have found it to be, I really do think it's much easier to be a woman.
So you're saying you get more respect specifically in a Muslim country?
You get, I'm not sure, you get more social respect, probably not more intellectual respect. But when a conversation deepens to that point anyway, then you really do have enough space to forget that you're a woman. Most people, if people will meet with you, then you are able to have many of the conversations that a man would have. And at points of highest danger, which would be, when you're unknown or the randomness of violence, then you are accorded more safety because you are a woman.
And is there any difference, take a country like Somalia, between the way a garden variety Muslim in Somalia, on the one hand, and a radical Muslim of the sort that would be a member of the Islamic Courts Union movement? I mean, is there any difference as you move across the spectrum from kind of moderate Muslim to radical, out-and-out jihadist, even in terms of how you are treated as a woman?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there have been certain projects that I've wanted to do with, sort of young jihadists that have been impossible because they couldn't spend that much time with a woman they weren't related to. There are ways around that. For example, one way would be to have a translator who is a woman who is related to them. So sometimes there's social code that prohibits entire stories from being done in a certain way. But, there were in Somalia, the members of the courts were so varied, and mostly, to be honest with you, the women who I spoke to preferred the courts because they were so much safer from rape during the courts, because there was so much more peace in the streets of Mogadishu. That is certainly not universally true. There's a doctor and her daughter who's also a doctor they live right outside of Mogadishu. They have 30,000 people living on their family farm. And during the early 90s, Bush Sr. even went to visit the mother to sort of commend her for her good work. Well, this time the international community hasn't showed up, and she has 30,000 people living on her land. And her daughter was talking about coming into the city during the courts. And obviously, these women they went to medical school in Russia. They're very tough cookies, and the younger doctor, the daughter, had been asked to veil herself more appropriately, and both the mother and daughter were worried that because they run a hospital, that should the court succeed, their hospital would be shut down. But then, of course, the courts never got there before they were overthrown by the Ethiopians. Okay,
well, let's talk about that whole situation, and correct me where I'm wrong. So, first of all, Somalia had been, of course, in a state of, inadequate governance, you might say chaos, for years and years and years. The Islamic Courts Union, a radical Islamic movement, took over last year, and, as you say, was welcomed by some people just for the sheer fact of restoring order. They were overthrown by Ethiopian forces that had America's support. We're longstanding, I guess, we financed the Ethiopian army for some time. And that happened, I don't know, 5-6 months ago or something. And then you went there when?
I was there in May.
After the restoration, after the Ethiopians took control.
Exactly. After the Ethiopians took control, there were Ethiopian soldiers on the ground already last year, but they really launched their attack right before Christmas, and then airstrikes on Christmas Eve. And so there was very much a feeling among residents of Mogadishu, most who were aligned with the courts, that Ethiopia's leadership had in some way launched the attack on that time as a Christmas present to America's Christian leadership. So that the timing of the attack, beyond the fact that many of the leaders who were actually being targeted at the time of the invasion were on the Hajj, they were out of the country, so they simply never came back. The attack was ill-timed for several reasons.
Okay, so the Ethiopians, with our support, technically restored a government that had been, not quite in exile, because they were floating around somewhere in that country, I guess, exactly. but the government that had always had our backing, but that had failed to govern, basically.
The government that was formed basically at a conference led by the UN in Nairobi in 2004. There have been a series of what we call transitional governments. One of the problems with them is that many are so, even though they're not nominally so, they end up being so clan-based that they basically reinforce some of the deeper divisions that are most problematic in Somali life, which are those of clan. So that's been one of the problems, and again, with this transitional government, that is the problem once again.
I'm sorry, I missed that a little. When you said the problem of the clans?
Yeah, the problems of the hereditary linkages through which are, they can certainly be overstated, but they are extremely important, less romanticized as clan than as simply, economic functioning units in the absence of a government. So that what's happened is when this transitional government is aligned with two clans in particular, which are then, for example, there's a huge telecom business in Somalia, and it's run by a rival clan. So the new government comes in, they want to cancel the contracts. They say that the other clan is linked to Al-Qaeda. In fact, that's their biggest selling point to the Americans. Everybody they want to kick out of the country is linked to Al-Qaeda, and I found that repeatedly. And it's extremely problematic because then all the soldiers, you call them soldiers, they're, young armed men who are really tribal militia. But they restart all these deeper-seated, long-term conflicts between hereditary groups.
Okay. And they tend to, when there's somebody they want to get rid of, they tell America that these people are associated with Al-Qaeda.
Oh, yes. Oh, and that's, yeah.
And sometimes it's probably true, I don't know, but you're suggesting it's not always.
Yeah, there's no question that the UIC, the Union of Islamic Courts, was absolutely, there were elements within it harboring members of Al-Qaeda. And it comes out of a longer-term Al-Ittihad al-Islami, which is a group that was also Al-Qaeda linked, that was overthrown in '96 by the Ethiopians. So it's, the UIC were no angels. At the same time, as we've seen the world over, right, the most common, the way in which rivals turn the U.S. and turn the proxies against each other is to say, oh, guess what? Like, for example, there was, when I visited the Prime Minister Getty when I was there, and a few hours at his house, and a few hours after I left his house, a suicide bomber crashed through the gate, killed 6 people, and wounded 10 others. And he was on the phone with me, within hours, saying, this is the true mark of Al-Qaeda, when in fact there's absolutely no evidence that was any more Al-Qaeda than any other suicide bomber.
Okay, yeah, that was a nice kind of ending to your New Republic piece.
Thanks, Bob.
That just what I would have chosen myself if I had had the courage to be there in the first place.
It wasn't that tough.
And one thing in reading your piece I kind of realized is that once the U.S. is associated with any kind of proxy force in the minds of the citizens of the country, we are tainted by everything they do. I mean, you were describing Ethiopia. Of course, Ethiopia is mainly Christian, although there's a big Muslim population. Somalia is almost entirely Muslim. And I guess a lot of these Ethiopian soldiers are Christians, and you were describing, at least I think, complaints that they do things like urinate in mosques and show various kinds of disrespect. And that, I gather, in the minds of a lot of Somalians is, I mean, it might as well almost be Americans doing it. It's, I mean, we're certainly associated closely with the whole endeavor.
Exactly. I mean, Ethiopia is 50-50 Christian-Muslim, but because the sort of Christian cabal has been in charge of the country for so long and ruled with such a repressive fist, that what's happened, I mean, largely the divisions in Ethiopia the religious divisions have been far less important than those of ethnicity. But one of the dangers of this occupation is that Somalis on both sides of the border will rise up more, that religious identity, as it has become in Kenya, which is extremely problematic, religious identity will become more pronounced, and that we will, in fact, create the very enemy that we are ostensibly fighting, not unlike Iraq in many ways with the insurgency.
Okay, I mean, it's an interesting question. It seems to be kind of a tough issue in the sense that, I mean, if you look at the specific dilemma we were faced with when the ICU took over.
Yeah.
Okay, we weren't imagining that they were kind of radical and, I assume, somewhat anti-American, had some linkage with Al-Qaeda. Yeah. They did institute a kind of a harsh Sharia law and so on. I mean, they would not have described themselves as friends of America, allies of America. The decision we made was we will back an Ethiopian force that dislodges them. I mean, as your article shows, that had a certain amount of downside because, first of all, the dislodging returned the people to a state of chaos they hadn't been enthusiastic about to begin with, and they associated us with that, with the decline of order, with the demise or the receding of the ICU, and then, beyond that, the fight has these religious connotations. You've got a Christian Ethiopian force backed by a large Christian American nation, and they had this historical issues with Ethiopia, so none of that aspect gives especially good PR to America. So, okay, there's all that downside, but there's also the question of, okay, what should we have done? I mean, one obvious alternative is nothing, and in a way, a question is, would we be better off? I mean, I remember reading the stories around this time, and there was some hopes. People who are against the Ethiopian intervention, some of them were saying, well, there's a struggle for control within the ICU. There's a relatively moderate element that could conceivably prevail. As I recall, they didn't.
Yeah.
And so kind of, so much for that hope. And I guess in a way the question is, do you think we would have been better off just, and it's in a way a broader question that may apply to other places, would we be better off, however bad the alternative to the intervention we sponsor, would we be better off just without it?
You know, that, and that is the question. I don't actually, I don't think non-intervention would have been a huge answer either, because there is to this day some question as to whether, the more liberal element of the courts was absolutely losing out to the more militant. That there's no question about that. But the more liberal element still had enough legitimacy, and they had said that they would invite America to help them basically catch these guys. I mean, one of the illusions is that nominally there were these three members, these three al-Qaeda guys. In reality, what the U.S. was more concerned about were hundreds, if not thousands, of foreign fighters who had gone to Somalia for training, potentially. And no one was quite sure what those guys were up to.
I'm sorry, those fighters were from where?
All over the world. I mean,
So it had become, so far as we can tell, possibly a training base for terrorists who then might go elsewhere.
Well, the reality of camps was extremely low. It's just that we had seen a pattern of foreigners arriving to work with the courts in different capacities, and we weren't quite sure what was going on. And it was more, again, it's the question of preemption. How can you ever know with preemptive force exactly what would have been? But what I wouldn't want to do is underrepresent the degree of real danger that was there in Somalia. So the idea of U.S. engagement does make sense. It's just a matter of strategic engagement. It just seems so clumsily handled. And in fact, the analysts who are deeply involved in Somalia have told me repeatedly that it was as if no one was claiming responsibility within the administration for the plans of linking up with the Ethiopians, because they were well aware of some of the dangers involved in that, in linking to such a repressive and notoriously abusive regime, especially in Somalia. So,
right, but when it's a matter of public record that you give them however much money to buy arms every year, it's kind of a tough secret to keep that they probably have your implicit support.
Exactly. Well, also what happened, there was the U.S. tried different things. We tried backing the hugely unpopular warlords who formed almost a kangaroo anti-terror group called, the Alliance to Restore Democracy and Anti-Terror, and it was a joke. And the CIA got caught delivering literal suitcases of cash to the warlords, not unlike Mohammed Afar Aidid, who we, in the 90s attempted to root out of Mogadishu despite anything. So it was only after that very public egg on the face on the behalf of the CIA that we then decided to back the Ethiopians. So we had tried other, again, possibly not terribly well-guided attempts, but we had tried other means.
So allying with the warlords didn't work. Allying with the Ethiopians hasn't worked. I mean, is there an alternative? Was there a third engagement option?
It's really... well, what would we say? I mean, look at what we poured how many billions of dollars into intervention in the mid-90s, in terms of aid. Like, was there a sort of a friendlier face to present, and that didn't work. So, to some degree, I think we could have been very well served by some dialogue with some very, very public dialogue with the more liberal elements of the courts, just to have shown that we went through that stage, possibly to shore them up, certainly to have given them the sort of public face to try to do something. I'm not unlike, look at Khartoum. Not a pretty story, but Khartoum due to U.S. pressure and sanctions, did kick out Osama and did reconsider its role with radical Islam. So there may have been more possibility in dialogue in that way.
Okay. And among, the downside, I alluded to the fact that much of the Somalian populace is not wild about what's resulted from our role in this.
Right.
There's no Al-Qaeda per se is making what propaganda it can out of this, right? That came through in your piece.
Exactly. Well, some of the most interesting things about writing that piece, about learning about the history of Africa Corps, Al-Qaeda's wing in Somalia, was how terribly Al-Qaeda had historically failed in Somalia, because for much the same reasons as the West did in the 90s, that in a country with absolutely failed states are not great places for Al-Qaeda to work normally. Weak states are much better because they need the same infrastructure that the West needs in order to create, effective agency. So I found that, and some of the letters, which are available for anyone to read on the West Point's Combating Terrorism Center, and they're called the 5 Letters from Africa, are just chilling, and in some places very funny. You have operatives writing back to Khartoum, these guys are too expensive, they won't leave their clan rivalries. One man even let his wife die, let her starve to death because he wouldn't pay the money to kill one of his 100 heads of cattle. So there is quite a history there, and quite a history of Al-Qaeda failure that is definitely important to note in the longer trajectory.
Okay. Now, I know you're working on a book, and I don't know how much you want to talk about it, if at all, but it has to do with religion and when different religions rub up against each other in Africa, right?
In Africa and Asia, yeah.
Yeah, not only the Somalian part of Africa. I don't know. I went to a presentation you gave in Washington, and I know you've been looking into the role of American evangelicals who go to Africa and proselytize. Are you, I don't know, do you feel like talking about that stuff or what?
Sure.
Authors have different philosophies about talking about books they're writing.
Right. I find it helpful because I get feedback, and I also, get criticism that's really helpful sort of in the formulation of things. First of all, I have one book that just came out, this book of poems.
The poetry book?
That's right, which I'm going to
I think you may be our first poet
you think so?
on Blogging Heads. And so I guess, I don't know, we should pause for a round of applause or something. What's the name of the book?
It's called Wideawake Field, and it's named after an airstrip that was used in World War II. So that's on Ascension Island. So that's
you're definitely the first poet we've had with a book of poetry named after an airstrip. I can confirm that.
Well, I'm honored. Thank you very much, Bob.
Just out of curiosity,
yeah.
that's a weird combination of things to be, like journalist who goes to war-torn places and poet. But it works for you, I guess.
I guess so. I don't look into it too much. I just kind of keep going. What the poems allow for. A lot of them have to do with things seen and experienced that can't really be solved, certainly not in the scope of nonfiction. So it would sort of be a weird, encounter with, young Uzbek boys who are selling American, military rations in Kabul and what that means to them. And that sort of just allows us, hopefully, to pause in moments that would otherwise not be, that would go unnoted because they're not conclusive enough for nonfiction, and to suppose in that sort of way would be somewhat, dangerous. But to do that in a poem and to allow things to be unanswered is okay and is helpful. So, yeah, that's one way they relate to each other.
Okay, so this will be your first nonfiction book?
This will be my first nonfiction book, and it's called The 10th Parallel. And it's not going to be out for a couple of years, if then, but inshallah will be out
The
then.
common problem with books I've found is that they're not going to be out for a while.
Yeah, exactly. But it is an examination of the space between the equator and the line of latitude 10 degrees north in Nigeria, Sudan, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Horn of Africa, and the Philippines. And it's that line, especially, it's stronger. It's definitely more marked in Africa. because of the wateriness of boundaries in Asia, in South Asia, it's a little bit different. But it is basically the southern edge of the Muslim world, and has been historically for different reasons in different places. And then what's happened in the past 50 years is there's been a huge global growth, as we all have heard about, of the Christian South. So a conservative form of evangelical Christianity, and not just one form, but many, many, many forms, have sprung up and come into contact with the southern edge of the Muslim world. So a lot of what I'm looking at in story form are the ways in which conflict that comes to be known as religious has, many causes. And like, for example, in Nigeria, you can look at land use as one. You have the pastoralists who tend to be Muslim and the farmers are Christian, and due to climate change, the one field, and just population growth, the one field has to have so many uses. And so at what point does conflict become known as or believed to be religious? And in some ways, the book is a way to undermine some of the easier cliches about religious conflict. But in other ways, it really is taking what people say on the ground, which is this conflict is about religion in this way or that way, and taking what people say at face value. People deserve to speak from their own conflict and not just from, our perspective that will say, oh, it's all economic, or it's all climate change, or it's not all, obviously it's not all one thing, but to let people speak for themselves about what their experience of how religion comes to bear in conflict is.
Right. I mean, there could be truth to both. In other words, so the basic scenarios, there's in some sense a natural conflict of interest in the sense that pastoralists and farmers will have sometimes conflicting interests.
Exactly.
And then along the same line is not just a vocational cleavage. It's the two religions, and it could be the case that real material conflicts of interest lead people to emphasize their religious differences, just psychologically has that effect. So that, for them it's a religious conflict, but at the same time, the feelings they feel so religious might be subdued or in some way different if there weren't the material conflict of interest underlying it.
Absolutely.
Right?
I mean, and in another way, we're looking at, identity is fluid, right? But for some reason, for many, many, many reasons, religious identity is becoming more and more pronounced. And that is, if you look at, especially in the developing world, but certainly here too, and you look at the way in which people use religion as a form of self-determination, whether it's a small cell group in an evangelical church in America, or it's its own parallel in a Pentecostal church in southern Nigeria. So religion is definitely more and more, the idea of a direct, unmediated relationship with God for both Christians and Muslims is increasingly important. And now, so taking that as a fact and tracing what the repercussions of that are, and Bob, you've said in the past, which I've actually found extremely helpful, which is, at what points does coexistence, does mutual respect and coexistence also inform what we should learn about this fault line? And that's something, these conflicts do tend to burn themselves out. And as we've spoken briefly before about, mostly it's through knowing each other. It's through the extremely practical neighborhood ways of knowing each other and saying, oh God, I can't send my boys out to lop off that man's head again because he knows me and he knows they're coming from me and we've talked about it. And so looking at some of the ways one can diffuse that sort of that tension as well is something that I'm just beginning to explore in the book.
Although I'd say it helps if the neighbors actually have a confluence of interest. There's some way in which they need each other,
Exactly.
Economic interdependence or striving together for some political goal, or there's this third neighbor they both hate or something,
Yeah, absolutely. And one other interesting point is that, the third neighbor they both hate is increasingly the West. This conservative Christianity that's so explosive in Asia and Africa and beyond, but that I'm looking at is not Western Christianity. In fact, it is explicitly non-Western Christianity. So, we were talking a little bit before about meeting places on moral grounds. These guys are very, very conservative, anti-homosexual. That's just one of them, conservative about women. So there are ways in which they meet in conservative values, which certainly bear looking at.
So for example, African evangelical Christians and adjacent African Muslims who have some conflicts and issues and so on, one thing that can actually bring them together is opposition to Western culture, to like Hollywood.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then, it depends, because so often their divisions serve, I was thinking the other day, it's really not that religion serves their political ends. It's that politics serves their religious ends, So at some point, those who choose to be divisive are going to find a point on which they're divisive anyway. Like, they may come together and be like, no gays in Nigeria. But at a certain point, they're also going to say, you're dead. There isn't sort of a deeper, I haven't found people able to find a deeper sustainable unity in around moral values if they already oppose each other by definition because of oppositional views of absolute faith. Which tend to be, especially in Nigeria, tend to be extremely competitive.
Okay, now there's another way religion can feed into the conflict, if I recall correctly, something you said at this presentation of yours I saw. And it's funny because I was reminded of it when I was reading a blog post of Bruce Feiler's recently. He was actually, he got a lot of FaceTime with President Bush because of his book Abraham.
Huh. Oh,
and, he was summoned to the White House, he and his family, and Bush sounded like quite a bit of time. And one thing in his blog, I'll link to it, I hope I'm quoting him more or less correctly, he said that Bush said something to the effect that, one difference between at least extremist Muslims or something and Christians was they force their religion on people. We don't. Something to that effect. I'll link to it to get it exactly right. But and of course, it's true that radical Muslims, don't exactly, have a soft touch sometimes. But I remember something from your presentation, which struck me, which was that along some of these fault lines between evangelical Christians and Muslims in Africa, the Christians are proselytizers and the Muslims not so much.
Oh, 100%. Because
and the Muslims consider that like almost an act of aggression.
Absolutely,
right?
Because it is the cost of identity. That's one of the weird realities of the opening of democratic space, especially, let's say, in Nigeria since 1998. But is this competition in the name of religion and the idea that, look, if you take our numbers from us, democratically we're going to lose out, and very much so. Islamic proselytization generally, the whole idea of da'wah or mission, does not explicitly, in the most part, target Christians at all. It targets fallen Muslims, where that is not true for more, let's say, effervescent conservative evangelical Christians. Their outreach is for anyone, and that is not true along Islamic lines.
So it is a kind of an asymmetrical, not literal warfare, but it's
spiritual warfare, which is a term that I have heard people use again and again and again. So, one of the challenges of this book is handling what can be extremely sensational, and people have no qualms about saying, handling it with enough context that but without undermining it, and letting people speak for themselves about what they've encountered in their lives. So it will continue to be a challenge, I think.
Now, do American evangelicals help energize the Christian proselytizing in Africa? Are they part of this whole dynamic?
To some degree, yes. For example, in Khartoum, when I was visiting with Franklin Graham a few years ago,
This is Billy Graham's son.
Exactly.
Who famously called, what unflattering thing did he famously say about Islam?
Oh, wicked and evil. He said,
That's unflattering.
It's known as the W&E comments. But Franklin is also much more complex man, and very. I had an interesting time with him. But he went. This was a few years ago, before Darfur. Obviously, this trip would be impossible now. He went for the one and only time to Khartoum to meet with President Bashir, who now stands accused of war crimes and genocide in Darfur. And so it was supposed to be this rapprochement and basically faith-based politics at their best. In fact, it was a bit of a farce because both men weren't really trying to meet each other. They were trying to score points in their respective political and religious identities. But during that trip, I came across, I was with a wonderful young Reuters reporter, and I said, I was looking into the idea of missionaries who don't, undercover missionaries. And she said, there's an aerobics studio in town and a tea house that's only for women, and I really think it's run by Christians. We're allowed to smoke there, and, there's a Christmas tree. And so we went for pizza. And, of course, I ended up meeting the missionaries who were appalled that they had been singled out by a reporter, but also an American. And they handled that pretty well. And
you mean that you even knew about their presence?
Exactly. Exactly. And that the community understood their presence because they weren't there on missionary visas because those visas would be impossible in Khartoum.
So they were trying to do like covert missionary work?
Exactly. That's exactly.
How do you do that? I mean,
aerobics.
At some point you got to fess up if you're really going to make the sale, right?
I know, right? But if people come in for aerobics and pizza and they smoke behind their high walls and complain about their brothers, that's another point of values, right? Because the idea is like, women's empowerment nominally. We're going to have a place for women so that they're not always put upon by, men, and they can do what they want to do, blah, 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 blah.
So these Christians are actually to some extent identifying themselves with Western vices, in a sense, smoking, right?
Right.
As part of their, I'm not shocked that they're kind of resented.
Right. Right. I would not want to generalize in that term. They are the only ones in that particular role who I've come across in any country. And there's so many missionaries doing extremely great work that it has nothing to do with proselytization, and so it's a hugely varied group, of course, by definition, and I think if there's one thing I've learned and continue to learn through the process of researching and beginning to write this book is that, if anything, the fault lines on each side, the fault lines between certain groups of Christians and certain groups of Muslims are as, if not more important than the division between them. So that there are these growing forms of religious identity really, really need mediation, possibly more so than across religious lines. So that's definitely one of the findings of the book, and one that I hope to explore more fully as going forward.
Huh. Well, it sounds like a great book.
Thanks.
Or a great book in the making.
Thank you.
I feel I could talk forever. I feel I should give you the opportunity to bail out, because when we first got on, you said, "So how long will this be? About 5 minutes?" And I said, "Eliza, welcome to Blogging Heads TV." No, and you had urgent business to take care of. Then you bargained for like 20, and I held out, but I think I told you it didn't have to be longer than 30, and it already is. So,
that's right. We're at 38, 34, 5. I think we're in a good place to stop.
Yeah, I think we are. And it gives us a lot to talk about in the future.
Yeah.
But thanks so much for taking the time. And safe travels in Nigeria, which is the next stop, right?
Yep. And thanks so much for having me, Bob. It's been a lot of fun.
Okay.
Okay.
My pleasure. See you around.
Thanks a lot.